About the author. My name is Edgar Bailey, epidemiologist. With more than 20 years of experience, I have 2 master's degrees and 9 postgraduate degrees in international disease management. I have worked in the United Nations, and in other international organizations. I have been part of missions in Europe, Africa, and Latin America in different programs for disease prevention, control, and eradication. This book is an analysis of the pandemic presented in 2020 with the purpose of providing a better understanding of the disease, the impacts on humanity and the role each person plays in avoiding getting sick. This is not the first time that a catastrophe of this magnitude affects humanity. But, in the face of this pandemic, is the right thing being done? What is correct, or what was correct? What consequences did the pandemic bring? And what may come next? This book has been created with the purpose of forming a better understanding of what a pandemic entails. It has been created for all those who love life and fight for a better world. This is for you. A little history. It is not the first time our humanity has faced a pandemic. Here is a short part of the history. The first recorded epidemic is the Justinian plague in the year 541 AD, which affected the Byzantine Empire when it was in its greatest splendor, overshadowing the mandate of the Emperor Justinian. It was detected in Constantinople, a city with more than 800,000 inhabitants at that time, and then spread to the entire empire. The tragedy was such that at some point the number of the dead exceeded the number of the living. In 2012, a group of researchers managed to isolate the Yersinia pestis bacteria from a corpse exhumed from one of the cemeteries used at the time of the plague. Then, between the years 1346 and 1353, humanity was affected by the Black Plague, which, in that short period of time, reduced Europe's population from 80 million inhabitants to only 30 million. In addition, the disease has not completely disappeared, as outbreaks have still been detected today. At that time, the cause and treatment were unknown. Black Plague is now known to be caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria as well. Rats, dogs, and fleas of the latter can be carriers of the bacteria. Smallpox, although it is known that it has affected humanity for thousands of years, in the 18th century reached mortality of 30%. Its highest rate of spread was during the voyages from Europe to America, when the conquerors of the New World carried sick people on ships. Fortunately, it is one of the few diseases that humanity has controlled through vaccination. The Spanish flu was an epidemic that was reported in March 1918, while the world was facing the First World War. Paradoxically, this disease was not discovered in Spain, but in the United States, and its name was given in that way because Spain had remained neutral in that war. The intention was to emphasize that diseases do not distinguish borders, nor differences of ideals. The Spanish flu, although it had only been a variation of the seasonal influenza viruses that were present at the time, killed more than 50 million people. The Asian flu in 1957, first recorded on the Yunnan Peninsula, China. It was a bird flu virus of the H2N2 type, and in less than a year it had spread throughout the world. The World Health Organization, WHO, fought for a long time to develop a vaccine to control this disease, but due to the genetic variability of influenza, that is the ability of the virus to create new variants of itself, makes it as necessary to be making new types of vaccines too, since these can lose their effectiveness against the new presentations that the virus presents from time to time. This pandemic registered more than 1 million deaths worldwide. In 1981, the acquired immunodeficiency virus, better known as AIDS, was diagnosed for the first time. Although the virus is not lethal, it affects the immune system in such a way that it leaves the body without defenses, causing any condition to be fatal. To date, it is estimated that more than 25 million people have died from the consequence of this disease. In the month of December of 2019, in the province of Wuhan, China, the acute severe respiratory syndrome SARS-CoV-2 was diagnosed for the first time, initially called nCoV-2 or 2019 novel coronavirus, which is a coronavirus of the beta coronavirus family. On March 11, 2020, when more than 114 countries were affected, with more than 100,000 people confirmed positive for the infection, and more than 4,000 people dead, WHO characterized the epidemic as a pandemic of SARS infection CoV-2 and the disease this virus causes like COVID-19. The phases of a pandemic. In the face of the COVID-19 disease pandemic, where the main concern is to decrease the rate of transmission between people, social distancing has been proposed as the most effective measure to avoid getting the virus as long as there is no vaccine or specific treatment for the disease. The treatments that are applied to patients suffering from the disease are focused on the reduction of their symptoms, that is, the reduction of fever and the use of artificial respirators to assist breathing, and to treat another problem that they present. The most frequently asked questions about the pandemic are, how long will it last? When will everything return to normal? Before you can answer these types of questions, you need to understand a little more about the phases of the COVID-19 disease pandemic. The prevention, control and eradication phases of the present pandemic are focused as follows. Phase number 1. Physical distancing. The ideal prevention measure is to avoid all social contact with strangers and stay at home. It is known that not everyone has this possibility and many people sooner or later must go out to get food, water, household supplies and even go to work. In summary, the pandemic is still in this phase. Phase number 2. This phase will be at the time that no new cases appear in an uninterrupted period of 14 days, and that is why the importance of quarantine and physical distancing. In this phase, health services must have complete knowledge of the population's health status through routine sampling, that is, be certain that apparently healthy people are really free for the virus and that the health system is capable of detecting and attending to any suspicion or outbreak. Phase number 3. The arrival of a vaccine. The application of an effective treatment to all those who suffer from the disease, regardless of age, race, or sex. Until this phase is reached, the use of a mask in public places will continue to be essential. Phase number 4. Preparation for a new pandemic. In this phase, all the necessary protocols for the prevention, control, and eradication of epidemics of this type and any other possible similar scenario must be carried out, and the governments must also prepare emergency funds to be able to attend future emergencies of this type, including epidemics that can occur in animals, since many of the diseases that affect them have the potential to affect humans as well, the triad in the epidemiological chain of diseases. For the development of a disease, 3 factors must be involved: the etiological agent, the susceptible host, and an environment where the latter two interact so that the disease can develop. The etiological agent, also known as a pathogen, which can be a virus, fungus, parasite, bacteria, or any other agent that can cause damage when entering a susceptible host. The susceptible host is the living being in which, upon entering an etiological agent, it will be able to get sick from the disease caused by the pathogen. There are diseases that affect more than one species, such as rabies, that can affect various mammals. There are also diseases that are specific to a single species, such as Huntington's disease in humans. The environment are the conditions of space, period of time, climate, temperature and humidity, among others, in which the ideal situations can be combined, so that the susceptible host and the etiological agent interact with each other, so that the diseases can incubate and develop. The epidemiological chain is the way in which the 3 factors of the epidemiological triad have an entrance door, a dissemination mechanism, and an exit door to find some other susceptible host in the environment. The natural history of diseases. A disease is the loss of normality of the functions of an organism or some of its parts. In medicine, diseases are also known as pathology, which means the disorder of the normal functioning of an organism, or any of its organs, and the causes that produce it. A disease and its development are listed in 3 parts: the pre-pathogenic period, the pathogenic period, and the post-pathogenic period. The pre-pathogenic period is when an etiological agent enters the organism and begins to replicate within it, causing changes in tissues and organs until its normal function is altered. The time of the pre-pathogenic period will depend on the incubation period of the disease. The pathogenic period comprises the time when the symptoms of a disease are presented. For example, if it is a respiratory disease, in this period is where sneezing, cough and respiratory distress will occur, among others. If it were an intestinal disease, the symptoms that would appear in this period would be diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. It is at this stage that the excretion and spread of etiological agents commonly occurs, but there are many diseases that begin this process before presenting symptoms. The post-pathogenic period is where the disease has already reached a resolution, the processes that cause changes and damage to tissues and organs have already occurred, the symptoms were presented, the immune system has done its work, and that is when the recovery of the illness. Depend on the disease, there are 2 possible outcomes in this period. Patients who recover, or those who do not recover, remain ill, and even die. Patients who recover and survive. Also, depend on the disease, they have 2 variants. Those who remain as healthy carriers, that is, those who are no longer sick, but still continue to excrete the etiological agent that made them sick, potentially contaminating others, and patients who recover and no longer present a risk for the spread of the disease. Mechanical vectors and biological vectors. Vectors are those agents that can play a role in the dissemination of an etiological agent, which can be mechanical and biological vectors. Mechanical vectors are those that do not play a role in the replication of etiological agents, and are generally inanimate objects, such as shoes and clothing, among others. Mechanical vectors can be all those that on their surface can carry an etiological agent and bring it to the entrance door to a susceptible host. Biological vectors are those that can harbor an etiological agent within your body and that can play a role in the replication of the agent. In other words, it can be a person suffering from one disease and contaminating another. It can also be a rat that can transmit the rabies virus to another rat, to another mammal, or even to humans. In the case of COVID-19 disease, the biological vectors will be those human beings who are infected and spreading the virus, and the mechanical vectors could be all those metal, paper, cardboard, and plastic objects that have had contact with a person sick with COVID-19. That is why everybody should always be careful and try to disinfect all those products purchased in the supermarket and do not know if someone could have contaminated them when handling them. The importance of diagnostic tests. Diseases can be asymptomatic, show no symptoms and signs, have one or more symptoms and signs, or even cause death. The diagnoses begin with a clinical examination, based on the signs presented by the patients, and the symptoms they are suffering in that moment. Then these must be complemented with an already more specific laboratory diagnosis, which searches for cause of the disease in doubt, until the agent is identified by means of the so-called gold standard test for each disease. For example, a respiratory disease can present the symptoms of cough and nasal secretions. A doctor during the clinical evaluation will be able to begin to intuit what type of respiratory disease it is, and when making the laboratory diagnosis can determine what type of defense cells are being involved. This will give an indication of the type of the etiologic agent that is attacking. Finally, the definitive cause of the disease must be determined using the specific laboratory techniques and for the suspected disease, the gold standard tests. It is necessary to remember that nor even the most experienced scientist should diagnose a disease without relying on laboratory diagnosis. The importance of quarantine and good hygiene practices. Using the COVID-19 disease pandemic as an example, when a treatment or vaccine has not yet been defined, the best strategy to prevent a person from becoming contaminated is to remove the susceptible host from the triad and the epidemiological chain. That is why the main recommendation is physical distance, since it has not yet been possible to find an adequate measure to eliminate the etiological agent, which has a worldwide distribution, replicates in humans, and survives in most climates. Simply put, quarantine is the most appropriate measure for people to avoid contamination with the virus, applying the appropriate hygiene measures to prevent the etiologic agent from entering a susceptible host, replicating, and looking for new people to infect. If you must leave your home, do not forget the following instructions. In the face of this pandemic, if you are going outside, to reduce the risk of contamination, 1. Tie your hair. 2. Do not go out with piercings, earrings or any other unnecessary jewelry or garment. 3. Wear eye protection and 4. Do not forget your mask. Upon returning home, immediately take a shower and wash the clothes you have worn on the street. Physical distancing and protective measures at work. Facing this pandemic, efforts should be made to implement the following physical distancing measures for workers and companies, regardless of whether a person is of an operational level, managerial, customer, or the owner himself. The schedules and routes of entry to the facilities must be controlled, ensuring that there is a space between person and person of at least 1.5 meters away. In the entrances of the personnel, there should always be the availability of soap and water so that they can wash their hands and even their faces properly, and then they must apply alcohol gel on their hands and wear a mask all the time. Job positions must be at least 1.5 meters away from one worker to another. To strengthen this measure, physical barriers can also be implemented among workers. In addition, as far as possible if the activity allows it, efforts should be made to include these types of barriers between the personnel and the products being produced. The role of pets in the epidemiological chain of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this pandemic, by early June 2020, pets such as dogs, cats and birds have not yet been scientifically proven to play a role in COVID-19 transmission. There are various theories about the source of the pandemic, but it must also be remembered that 3 factors, the epidemiological triad, are needed for a disease to develop. The COVID-19 disease pandemic and its impact on humanity. The quarantine. With the absence of a vaccine or a cure to combat the disease that is affecting, the main measure is the physical distance from other people, to avoid contagion from each other. The problem is that this disease has an incubation period of approximately 14 days, and not all people have the capacity to go this time without going to work, without opening their businesses, and there are even people like the sick, and the elderly, who they need day-to-day care, or 24 hours a day care. There are also activities that cannot stop, like the food chain. This has complicated that the quarantine can be carried out fully. It is a good time to think about on the sensitivity of the system in which humanity is currently planted, a system that cannot withstand 14 days of total economic cessation. If the required quarantine were for a day, it is very possible that all this would have been already forgotten. Diagnostic tests and statistics of COVID-19 disease. Diagnosis is one of the pillars that supports the management of an epidemic. It helps us determine if a person is sick with what is suspected or not. Not all coughing illnesses are common flu or COVID-19. Not all diseases that cause vomiting are food poisoning. Currently in the media there are various issues and conflicting opinions on the number of diagnostic tests performed in each country. Many people only compare the numerator and even argue about it, but remember that in an epidemic the denominator should not be left aside, that is, the complete formula must be tests carried out divided by the total population, then it can be multiplied by the factor that is calculated to determine percentages or rates for more detailed calculations. The United Nations Organization estimates that humanity is more than 6 billion people on the planet, so the number of tests carried out worldwide does not even come close to that number. In addition, the fact of obtaining a negative result in the morning does not guarantee that the same afternoon, that person will be contaminated and may become sick later. The ideal model should guarantee a sanitary status, that is, that the population be sampled in its entirety every 14 days, incubation period, without interruption. Otherwise, only people who are tested will know if they are carriers of the virus or not at that time, and it should not be forgotten that on the same day, these people could become contaminated and become sick days later. Finally, no diagnostic test is 100% effective. The best diagnostic techniques provide a certainty between 95 and 99% confidence. There will always be the possibility of false positives and false negatives. The economy. For many, it seems that the big loser in this pandemic is the world economy, but the truth is that many economic activities have totally diminished or ceased. The best example is tourism. Most countries have opted for the cessation of recreational activities and tourism as a preventive measure. Those large hotel chains and independent tour guides have greatly affected in this pandemic. A remarkably interesting case is that of the oil industry. With a large part of the population quarantining their homes, the use of either own vehicles or public transport has dropped considerably to the point that by the month of April 2020 it was worth more than a liter of milk than a barrel of oil. The base of the current economy is practically the oil industry. A brief analysis of why. For example, a pizzeria, ovens, furniture, utensils, raw materials such as flour or sauce were once transported in a vehicle that uses fossil fuel to move. So many wars and geopolitical problems fought by oil, and the COVID-19 pandemic left the fuel that moved the world to the ground. The food industry has also been affected in this pandemic, since a large part of the population, when sourcing to enter quarantine, bought food packaged in non-perishable short-term presentations, such as canned, powdered, vacuum-packed food, and dehydrated among others. The above, added to the decrease in social events in hotels, salons and restaurants, the reduction in recreational and tourism activities, caused an increase in the supply of fresh products, at the same time that the population was focused on buying products not perishable. This greatly affected market prices, and now the challenge is to balance supply and demand again. In addition to betting on strengthening the industry to meet the needs of the current market and possible future scenarios. The earth and the environment. Not everything is bad news. Despite the ravages that the COVID-19 disease has caused humanity, the animals are returning to places that they had been absent for centuries. The hole in the ozone layer has been greatly reduced in just a few months. Rivers, lakes, springs, and the sky, in many places are recovering their normal hue, and if the planet itself has managed to have a respite from the damage that the human being caused selfishly day by day. Hopefully, this is an opportunity for humanity to learn to live better with nature at the end of this pandemic. Since, in a way, this disease sent humanity back to the caverns, which could be a lesson in humility, a lesson realize how fragile human beings and humanity are. The importance of mental health during quarantine. The quarantine to contain the disease COVID-19 came to change the routine of humanity, modifying the customs of work, locomotion, education, sports, entertainment, and the economy in general. Suddenly, people around the world have been recommended to join quarantine. This can give consequences for people's mental health. The uncertainty of not knowing how long the quarantine will last. When will a cure or vaccine be developed? And the abundance of news on the subject can create disorders such as anxiety and insomnia, among others. That is why you should seek to create a routine that keeps the mind busy and free of bad thoughts and uncertainties. People must not stop exercising, and eat well. And when the time comes to go out to stock up or work, you should not forget the recommendations for physical distance and the use of a mask. The importance of mental health during quarantine. The quarantine to contain the disease COVID-19 came to change the routine of humanity, modifying the customs of work, locomotion, education, sports, entertainment, and the economy in general. Suddenly, people around the world have been recommended to join quarantine. This can give consequences for people's mental health. The uncertainty of not knowing how long the quarantine will last. When will a cure or vaccine be developed? And the abundance of news on the subject can create disorders such as anxiety and insomnia, among others. That is why you should seek to create a routine that keeps the mind busy and free of bad thoughts and uncertainties. People must not stop exercising, and eat well. And when the time comes to go out to stock up or work, you should not forget the recommendations for physical distance and the use of a mask. The role of intuitive thinking, rational thinking, and how this pandemic affected humanity. The uncertainty of what will happen now? Most humans tend to trust their feelings rather than the facts, an individualistic and evolutionarily trend. Studies of risk perception in humans emphasize that there are two modes of thinking, the intuitive and the rational. The latter is based on evidence and reason, rather than on feelings. In the process of evolution of the human being, the learning was developed in the first instance in an intuitive way. The fear of a dangerous animal was based on the qualities of the animals and the experiences that they had with them, and to know if a plant was suitable for consumption or not, before someone had to test it. Intuitive thinking is not bad, on the contrary, it helps the human being day by day to make good decisions. For example, if you hear a dog bark in a fierce way, the safest thing is not to get close to where that animal is. If a foul odor is felt, it is best to stay away from that location if the cause of the odor need not be determined. Intuitive thinking is an advantage that the human being has developed thanks to the evolution of the brain. But this kind of thinking doesn't get along very well with numbers and statistics. Since it will be up to people to interpret data, and that is where intuition betrays. Some people may be alarmed when listening to 100 cases, others will not cause any fear, for others the alarm will be 1,000 cases, but this is not how statistics work, 100 cases in 100 people. Intuition will make a person imagine the denominator that suits their convenience or possible understanding of the problem, and in an environment where bad information is everywhere, many people, before looking for the rational part of the matter, will prefer to make decisions based on their intuition. In the 1999 the Dunning-Kruger effect was published, which describes a cognitive bias, according to which individuals with little ability or low knowledge present a feeling of superiority, considering themselves more capable than other more prepared people. And because of this effect is that many people have considered that the disease of COVID-19 and its effects on human health are false. The human being does not adapt to his environment, he adapts his environment to his needs and whims. That is why for what he has built large cities and structures throughout history, he changed the landscape for a painting and a sculpture. This has created a human need to have the feeling of control, and in the face of this pandemic, where the most that can be done this time that there is no cure or vaccine, is to go into quarantine, which caused the phenomenon of agglomeration in stores to stock up on what is considered essential, in the search to maintain that feeling of being in control. This was accompanied by another phenomenon that arose: the excessive purchase of toilet paper. This also has its explanation. It is not the same to see a supermarket shelf without 25 cans of tuna, as to see a shelf without 25 packages of toilet paper. This illusion of the empty shelf, plus the situation of the pandemic, and the quarantine with its uncertainty of how long it will last, makes the brain consider that it is a product that will be in short supply, which provides some comfort, and not having it can lead to uncommon and uncomfortable practices. That is why hysteria turned to re-establish that need to have the feeling of control of that situation, is to think that even as there is not this product in stores, I do have enough at home. Rational thinking about this pandemic should focus on understanding where a part of this problem is, and what can be done about it. If a person has not yet been infected, what should be done to avoid becoming contaminated and ill? It would seem little just wear a mask and have good hygiene practices, but even the fact of hand-washing procedure has its science. Any surgeon will be able to talk more than an hour about the correct procedure. The use of a mask also has its science, and more than all the main care must be when removing it, to avoid contaminating our hands with the etiological agents that it may have retained. If unfortunately, a person becomes ill, what should they do to receive care? What should they do to avoid contaminating others? What should they do to recover and not die? Thought and energies must be focused on this, on being truly prepared and if you are accredited and qualified sources to provide true information on the subject. The pandemic and its similarity to the 5 stages of mourning. Humanity has been marked by a before and after, due to the COVID-19 disease, pandemic. By March 2020 a pandemic had already been declared, and at the end of April there were already more than 3.5 million infected in all over the world, and over 250,000 deaths had occurred. Alarms sounded, some were well attended, others were not. Health professionals have given their best effort trying to contain the problem both in patients and at the laboratory level in the development of a vaccine. Politicians and leaders of the world try to give the best recommendations for the people to take the due precautions. But what about humanity? What happened to life that was considered normal? The time has come to rethink whether this world really is of the human being and whether it was doing things well. It was in 1969 that the psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first proposed the 5 stages of mourning in her book on death and dying, which are denial, anger, negotiation, depression, and acceptance. The author mentions that one does not go through them in a prescribed order but rather it is a journey to learning, and where it is finally understood that it is possible to live with the loss, each one takes different time to overcome each of the stages, and there are those who they are forever submerged in one of them. What happened to mankind with the COVID-19? How this it affects humanity and how will it have to cope with all the lives lost and the other damages caused? It will not be an easy path, much less a short one. Like any disease, illness of epidemic, the longer it took to implement the appropriate measures, the more time and money it will cost their recovery to a status quo. The following is a brief analysis of the learning process that this pandemic can leave humanity, based on what Kubler-Ross described. The denial. For this case, there are many points of view, but the beginning of the problem or epidemic can be cited as an example, in which many were skeptical since it would have some economic repercussion. We can also quote people who did not want to attend to the alarm issued by the WHO. Then comes the type of thinking, that is there, far away, it is not going to happen here. There are also thoughts, that is an invention of a group of people to harm one sector and make it grow another. With globalization, overcrowding, poor urban planning, and humanity's lack of focus on what really matters, such as the health of people, animals, and the planet. Life as it was known, in less than 3 months has changed in such a way and in dimensions that no even in science fiction movies is seen. After denial comes the state of anger. It is when resentment, anger and frustration come. Many times the human being prefers to blame something or someone else, before accepting their responsibility, and in this situation phrases are heard in the population such as, they did not act in time, they were not prepared, they did not worry about investing in health, and many other things. The latter is when the problem is still perceived far away, when people still have that feeling as a spectator of it, when in this case, all humanity is at the same level, and this is what the disease COVID-19 came to remember. No, there are borders, social classes or any other classification that the human being has given himself the luxury of inventing to feel different or superior to others. Presidents, big businessmen, children, the elderly, men and women have suffered from the disease, and in this pandemic, all human beings are exposed equally. From the point of view where there is an impact, be it in health, or of an economic nature, come the frustrations of not having been ready, but whose fault is? From the politicians? Or, the people who have allowed themselves to be manipulated by others, allowing humanity to reach this point where things change dramatically, without warning? The frustration for an entrepreneur of not being able to do business. Now what can the carpenter do who made and sold furniture to earn a day-to-day? What can be done now? A wise man would say, "I want it is not intense enough." A virus appeared for which humanity was not prepared. At the beginning a small part of the population was affected, a smaller part of humanity was really fighting against the situation, as doctors, scientists and others applying sanitary measures, and a large part much larger than the first two, went to the supermarkets to run out the toilet paper of the shelves and even got to fight in a very primitive ways for that product. After anger, the next learning process in mourning is negotiation. But in the face of this epidemic, it is one of the most delicate processes, since, who will negotiate? What will he or she negotiate? Will the currency of exchange be people's health and life? Who will make the decisions? Will they be based primarily to safeguard people's health or will be to avoid an economic recession? Although the possible impact on the health of humanity and the economic consequences that this pandemic may bring have not fully determined, the main bet must be on the health of people, since it is easier to start from scratch than to revive people. It will be easier to reactivate an economy with healthy people than with dead or sick people. Although it is necessary for certain activities to continue, employers, before thinking about the merchandise, product, or byproducts that they produce, should think about taking care of personnel, to avoid that they become ill, and may contaminate others. The main measure is quarantine, and if a worker becomes sick and he had contact with 50 other colleagues, the ideal would be for those 50 people to go into quarantine too, which in the end would affect the activity in the company. After negotiation, the next process of mourning is depression. It will be the time when people who are engaged in certain activities such as tourism companies, recreation, beauty, social events and sports, among others, see that during the quarantine they cannot continue operating. It will be the time when savings no longer would be enough to pay rent, and miscellaneous expenses. It will be the moment in which unemployment reaches different people dedicated to so many other disciplines that had been conceived in this system that is currently being affected. It will be the moment when people can no longer generate enough income to supply the services of the minimum basic needs. It will be a very difficult time. Even from the beginning it is already being difficult time for many. It will be a key moment to learn, a moment to reinvent from the inside, and it will depend on each person. That is not only a painful moment, that is not the end, it may be a sacrifice, but many times, to win, something must be sacrificed. Once who have endured the pain and have overcome it, will be able to get up and continue moving forward, since the secret is not in knowing how to fall, but in being able to get up. And the latter is what the last process of mourning is about, acceptance. A message for the future. Thank you very much for the time to this book. It was made with the intention of helping to understand from a simple point of view this pandemic of the COVID-19 disease. This difficult time, it is also a good time to reflect and grow as people and even reinvent yourself. Let your loved ones know how much they matter to you and hopefully, that a near day this world is a better place to live, everyone in peace. The end.